Welcome to this video. Great to have you on board. In this video, I will walk you through the new Vue CLI version 3. We have a Vue CLI already, version 2, and it allowed us to create new Vue projects using pre-built templates. You had a registry of templates and you could choose one and then simply clone that template, initialize it with some starting options that were presented to you by the template authors basically, and then get going with that. Most of the time, you would probably use that Webpack-driven template, which was one of the available options, and there's nothing wrong with using that. You can continue using that. But the new CLI gives you more options and follows a different architecture, a different approach. So let's have a look at that new CLI and its most important options and how to use it. Obviously, we'll start using it in the command line, and I'll show you a small demo of the CLI. But let's first get the big picture. How does the new Vue CLI work? After you installed it, for which I will show you the command in a second, you can run Vue create to create a new Vue project. Previously, with the old CLI, you used Vue init, and this command can still be enabled, but more on that later. But now you use Vue create to create a new project. And then you're presented with a choice. Do you want to use a preset, and you can save your own presets, or use some pre-built one? Or do you want to create a new project where you configure everything on your own? Now, if you use a preset, then you're done. You get the options of the preset and you get a project with which you can work. If you choose custom config, you can choose from a set of different plugins you can add to your CLI project. Because the new Vue CLI is heavily plugin driven. You can add your own plugins even, you can write your own plugins and distribute them, and you can add functionalities to a Vue CLI project by adding plugins. And some choices are presented to you when installing or when creating a new project. You can add plugins like linting, progressive web app support, and way more. We'll see it in action soon. You can then, once you're done, also save that as a new preset if you want, so that you can use it for future creations and you don't have to go through that manual config process for every new project. So you can save your own favorite template. And once that is done and you got a new project, either with a preset or with your custom configuration, you can, of course, develop in there, get features like a development server, hot reloading, all that fun stuff which you would expect. And you can, of course, build your project. So then it's close to the old CLI, but of course with the config and the power of the new CLI. You can then also add plugins to that project after you created it. And that's a huge advantage compared to the old CLI. There you got this template, you couldn't configure that much, and once you created the project, it was pretty hard to change that configuration. You basically had to dive into the Webpack configuration file to add features, and whilst you can of course do that, it's not that much fun. With the new CLI, you can easily pull in official plugins, and I will show you how such plugins are distributed and how to find them. You can easily pull in such plugins into your existing project and add the functionality you want without creating a new project. That's a huge plus. So this is how the CLI works in the big picture. Now let's take a closer look at that and let's actually start using it. And let's of course start with installing it. Now for that, you run npm install -g to install it globally at Vue CLI, and that's important. The old CLI could and can still be found at Vue CLI, written like this, Vue-CLI. The new CLI is found at Vue/CLI. So these are two different packages, and you can use either of the two. You don't have to upgrade, and by default with Vue-CLI, you still get the old one. This is the new one. You can, of course, also use Yarn to install that if you're using that. It's an alternative package manager. And on Mac and Linux, you probably need to add a sudo in front of that to get the right permissions to install that. On Windows, it should work without sudo. Then you can hit enter. You might be prompted for your password. And then the CLI gets installed. And now it's important. This will replace the Vue binary which you used to run Vue init. So from now on, you can't run Vue init anymore, at least not without a little change or a little addition, which I will show you later. So let's wait for this installation to finish now. Now with the CLI installed, you can run Vue create to create a new project. And there's one thing you need to specify here, and that is the project name. So I'll name it Vue CLI-new. You can of course choose any name you want. Now you can hit enter then. And once you do that, you can choose a preset here. Now I already created one dummy preset and I saved that. That is why I can choose it. You can also go with the default preset, which you see which features it gives you. It gives you Babel so that you can use next-gen JavaScript features and linting, or, very interesting, manually select features. If we hit enter there, we can check these features by navigating with the arrow keys and hitting space on any feature we want to mark. So there we can add things like Babel, progressive web app support. We can decide if we want to use the Vue router in the project or Vuex. If we want to add CSS pre-processing, so if we want to use Sass, for example, linting, unit testing, all these things. Once you're done, you can simply hit enter. And now some of the plugins might need additional configuration. For example, the linting plugin here is asking us for which linting rules to use. And I'll go with the standard config here. I also have to choose if I want to lint on save, and that's also coming from that linting plugin. And I will confirm the default here. And then you can define where you want to manage your options in dedicated config files, which will be added to your project folder, or do you want to manage all the configuration in the package.json file? And I will go with the dedicated config files. You're then prompted whether you want to save that preset for future projects. And if you hit yes, you can give it a name, standard, custom, whatever you want. And now if you run Vue create again, you'll have this as an option. Now let's wait for this to finish. And whilst it finishes, let me show you something interesting. In your user folder on your operating system, you'll find that Vue.rc file. It's a hidden file, so you might need to turn on the option to view hidden files. And if you inspect that, let's say with the normal text edit app, then this actually is the global configuration for the new Vue CLI. And there you also see all the presets you created. So let me increase that. Here you see that presets node. That's my dummy preset, and that's the one I just configured. And there you see which plugins you added for this preset, and for each plugin, if it requires additional configuration, which configuration options you chose. So this is where this gets stored, and this of course also is a place where you can edit this. For example, if I wanted to get rid of my test1 preset, well then I could of course simply delete it from here, like this. In the meantime, my installation finished, and we're now ready to use our new project. We see some commands with which we can get started here, so I can simply navigate into my newly created folder and run npm run serve, which is an npm script automatically generated to use the locally, so in that project, installed Vue CLI to bring up the development server and build a development bundle. So if I hit enter here, this will bring up that dev server, build the project for the first time, and once done, it'll allow you to visit this URL here to visit your running page, which is live reloading upon changes, has hot module reloading, all that fun stuff you would expect. Here it is. That's the starting page it generated for you. Now let's have a look at that project it gave us in an IDE. I opened the project in Visual Studio Code, the IDE I'm using here. It's a free IDE. And in this project, we see this is what the CLI generated for us. We got a bunch of config files, since I chose that store each configuration for each of the features we're using in a separate file. And we got that package.json file where we see the scripts it gave us. These are the scripts we can run with npm run and then the script name. And there we got a script for development and serving that development server, and for building the production app. This will automatically use production-ready settings and optimize everything. We also see some dependencies here, and one thing you won't see, neither here in the dependencies nor here in the configs, is the Webpack configuration. Now the Vue CLI does use Webpack under the hood. It basically hides it away in these Vue CLI plugins, or to be precise, in the Vue CLI service here. This is where it uses Webpack. And you can't directly access the Webpack configuration, though you can extend it, and details can be found about this advanced feature in the official docs of the CLI, to which you of course find a link attached to this video. You don't really have to tweak that though, because as you will see in that link, you can add things to the config if you need to, but most of the time using these plugins gives you a lot of power and a lot of features. Now, here in the package.json file, we also see that browsers list thing. This allows you to set up which browsers you want to support with your project. And this is important for plugins like the, or for tools like the auto prefixer, which will be added automatically. It's already part of the default setup, which will take your CSS code and automatically prefix it such that it works best in the selected browsers here. It's the same for Babel. Our setup here uses Babel to give you next-gen JavaScript support, and this will automatically give you polyfills for features you're using depending on which browsers you support. So it's already detecting what it needs to add. Therefore, this is your browser list, and you can tweak this. You'll also find a link to explanations on how to work with that and what you can write there attached to this video. And the other files here, well, there you can dive in to configure, for example, the linting, to configure the compilation of your CSS code, to configure Babel. Most of the defaults should be fine, but if you need to, you can tweak the configs of these packages. Now, what about these two folders, public and source? The public folder is where you have that index.html file for your single page app. You will see the manifest.json file, which is related to the progressive web app. This file basically provides metadata information about your app, which can be read by the browser to make it installable on the home screen. And you can also store some static assets here, though I will also show you that there is another way of adding assets, which is recommended, since that other way will be handled by Webpack, which will do additional optimizations, whereas any assets you add in the public folder will simply be copied to your production-ready app and will not be optimized anymore. The source folder then is where you write your code. Here is that assets folder. That's the other way I was talking about. This file here, for example, will be analyzed by Webpack and will be optimized. And then besides that, you write your Vue.js code. You got your main.js file where your Vue app starts, where you have the root Vue instance. You have the router where you set up your routes configuration. Since we added UX, you got a default store with which you can start working. Register service worker, you don't need to tweak it right now. You can, of course, if you know what you're doing. This will basically register a service worker to give you that progressive web app support. App view is our root Vue component. Then in the views folder, we find the pages to which we can navigate. We could, of course, also store them in components or wherever you want. And components in this setup is simply non-routing components. So components which you don't load through the router, but which you embed through their tag in other components. This is the setup we have here. This is what the CLI gave us. And now we can work with that setup just as you work with the other setup. You can now start adding components. There's really nothing special about this. The syntax is the same. It's the same framework, but it gives you more features. And let's have a look at some of these more features and what exactly we can do. One thing we can do, for example, and I mentioned this earlier on the slide, is we can add plugins after we created this. And for this, of course, we need to know which plugins exist. All plugins, including the ones you could create manually, have to follow a certain naming pattern. The packages published on npm have to be named Vue-CLI-plugin- and then the name of the plugin. And you can choose that name on your own if you're developing such a plugin. And here we already see some plugin suggestions by Google. There also are some official plugins. They are stored in a @Vue CLI plugin folder. There we have things like Babel, linting. These were the options you could choose from during the setup. But if you add your own ones, or if you want to use plugins developed by other Vue developers, well, then you would name the packages like this. And here, for example, let's have a look at that Vuetify plugin. We can install that plugin into our project. And to install it, we don't need to run npm install. But for packages which are named like this, and that's important, this has to be the name, you can run a command in the terminal, and this is the normal terminal here, just opened in my project, and that command is vue add, and then just the last part of that name. So here we can add Vuetify. So I can run vue add Vuetify, and it will automatically find this package because it follows that naming convention, and will install it and set it up and run through any prompts this plugin might ask me. You'll find a link to how you can create your own plugins in the video description so that you get a deeper understanding of how you could create your own plugins. And this is, of course, a cool feature because it makes your app very extensible and it's easy to add new features to it after you create the project. So here the CLI, the Vuetify CLI plugin, for example, asks me if I want to use a certain pre-made plugin. which would replace some of my files. And let's choose yes here maybe. We can choose a custom theme. I'll hit no. The a la carte components, now that's something Vuetify specific, which would simply mean we install or we import each component on its own to keep our bundle small. So let's use yes. Yeah, let's add a polyfill and let's hit enter. And now this will install the package, the npm package. We could have done that without the Vue CLI with npm install. But the thing it does besides that is that it adds this extra configuration, these extra prompts. It changes the project as you saw. It changed our files. And if I now bring up that dev server again, and for that I have to quit it first, you should quit it and restart it after, doing bigger changes like this. If I now run that again, npm run serve is the command. Now it will start the development server again, and hopefully the Vuetify plugin didn't break anything, so we should still see a working app here. Yes, we do. And this is now using Vuetify and gives us that default setup which we installed with our prompt answers. And that is how to think about the new CLI. It's plugin driven. You can set up a configuration which is very detailed when you create a new project, and you can always add plugins to the existing project thereafter. You can also still install packages without the CLI, of course. You can still run in a new terminal window here, npm install and then whichever package you need, because not every package you need is a Vue CLI plugin. For example, Axios, as far as I know, doesn't have a Vue CLI plugin yet. So if you install Axios, you still would have to do it like this, and then you can use it as taught in the Axios module of this course. So you're not limited to Vue CLI plugins only, but if you got such a plugin, installing and adding it is particularly easy. Now, there is a special case, and that is related to CSS. You might remember that for creating this project, I didn't check the CSS preprocessor option. Therefore, my project here doesn't have Sass enabled. And this, of course, means that if I decide to write some Sass code here, let's say in this home component, which now uses Vuetify here, I got my small style there, and let's say I want to change that style. And I want to change it by using some Sass features. So I actually want to select it like this. I add my footer, because that is where I have that small element. And I'll be targeting this here, by the way, this name of the author of this quote. So I can select the footer element, and then I want to create my curly braces, and in there I want to style small. And this is not valid CSS syntax. In SCSS we can use that though, and it basically is then converted to this CSS syntax. But the cool thing about SCSS is that you could argue that this syntax is a bit easier to understand. So I want to target small here and give it a red color. Now, as I said, this is not valid CSS syntax. So I have to switch to SCSS. And for that, I can go to my style tag and add the lang element here and rename this or add the SCSS option. Now, this is not marked as an error anymore, but I get an error. And that error is, of course, that it failed to compile because it didn't find a loader, basically a compiler for Sass. And indeed, we just have to install it. And this is one thing which is not managed through a CLI plugin. That's why it's a special case. Instead, you can just run npm install --save, and then it's Sass loader, and you need one other package, which isn't mentioned here, node-sass. With that, you hit enter, and now this will install that through the normal npm installation path. So no CLI magic is used here. And this will make sure that the CLI project here can compile your code. Because the cool thing is, it has a setup where it will basically check for the existence of Sass loader and node-sass. And if it does exist, it will compile your code from Sass to CSS. And otherwise, it won't. So it has this auto detection, we could say. And now with that, if I bring up my development server again, we should see a red author name because of my SCSS code, which is now compiled. And indeed, if I reload, it's red. So this is working. And this is just a special case I wanted to bring to your attention. if you want to switch from CSS to SCSS for an existing project, you don't have to create a new one. You can do that simply by installing these two packages. And you can, by the way, also use other CSS preprocessors. Check out the official CLI docs. There you'll find instructions on how to use a stylus or less if you want to use that. We already saw quite a lot of the very nice features the new CLI offers us. Now, one common thing you need in bigger apps is environment variables. Environment variables are configuration variables, you could say, or global values which you want to inject into your app. For example, URLs, which then might differ in the production and in the development environment. A good example would be API keys or URLs. For your testing environment, you might reach out to some testing API or to an API with a test API key, which has a lot of access rights, for example, attached to it. For production, you don't want to use that same key or that same URL. Instead, you want to use a production-ready URL, and you want to swap that API URL or that API key. Now, obviously, you can manually edit your code right before you build your app for production, but it would be nicer if you could simply store your values and then automatically inject them into your code and just reference these global values and have them replaced automatically. And the CLI supports that. Let me show you how this works. Not at the example of a HTTP request I send, but still of a URL I want to output, let's say. So in my home.vue file, which is basically that page which is loaded here, let's output something there. And there I will add a h1 tag, or let's say a paragraph to make it less big. A paragraph where I say hello, just to see that this works. Yeah, there it is. And now let's say we want to output a URL here. The URL to which we would normally send a HTTP request. Now obviously we can send it there. So here I have my dev.api.com URL. And this is, as the name suggests, my development API, let's say. So for development, it's fine that this gets printed. But if I now build this for production, I don't want to use that. So for that, I don't want to hard code it in there. Instead, I want to store it in some environment variable file, which is then handled by the Vue CLI. For that, I can create a new file here in my project folder, which I name .env. Now, .env is a file which will automatically be picked up by the CLI, where I can store values which I can use in my project. And environment variables are simply key value pairs. And there you can add a Vue_app URL name, and then an equal sign, and then the value, which could be my https dev.api.com value. Now with that added, if you save that, you can reference this name in your components or in your code, not just in the components. You could, of course, also use it in your Vue instances. So there you could use it in computed properties, in watchers, anywhere. You can use it in your entire project, essentially. It's injected everywhere. You can use it in the Vuex store. You can use it everywhere. And actually, I will use it in such a way here in home Vue. There, I can't directly output it in my template because it's injected into my code, but it's not set up as a Vue instance data property, which I could output here. So instead, it will be available in all my JavaScript code. So let's add my script tag there. This creates the Vue instance for this component, or allows us to configure it, I should say. And there I can add that data field, which has to be a function here, as you learned, where I return my URL, let's say, and here I then reference process.env.vueAppURL. That's important. You don't use just a name like this. Instead, you add process.env. And this is simply a hard-coded or a provided object, you could say, provided to you by the Vue CLI, which gives you access to your global variables. And now we can use that URL property here in our paragraph with string interpolation like this. Before we see that though, I need to restart my dev server for it to pick up that env file and really take it into account in its configuration. Once this is done, after reloading, you see that URL here. Now, of course, I mentioned that we could use that to swap that value. And right now, we have a global place where we can manage it, which already is nice and suffices in some cases, because now at least you can manage your URL here. And if you use it in different components, you only have to change it in one place to change it everywhere. So that's already great. But to also get that different value thing going, you can simply add another file here. And that is the .env. And now you got different modes. You got 3 modes out of the box. You got a development mode, you got a test mode, and you got a production mode. And these modes are simply global configurations automatically managed and handled and set by the Vue CLI. So if you name that file .env.development, then this file will be used during development. So now if I take my Vue app URL here and add it into this file, and here I use dev, and for the other file, I use just api.com without dev, like this, then you will see that this .env.development file will be used after restarting the server here with npm run serve. So after restarting this, we should now see dev here in our page still. So if we reload this, we still see dev API, and not this URL, which I set up in the .env file, which we previously used. So it now uses this file because of the .development, because this is one of the default modes the CLI supports. And as I said, alternatives are production. So if you had a .env.production file, then this one would get used for production builds, which you, by the way, create by running npm run build. This will automatically set mode production. And you have a test mode too. For that, you can add a .env.test file. And you don't need to add all these files, only need them in places where you really want to override some setting. So I will get rid of test and production here. But if you need that, if you need to get rid of a setting and overwrite it, then these files help you with that, because they will then override any keys you might set in other env files. And one important note about the key names. I named mine Vue app underscore URL. Now you need to name it Vue underscore app and then your name for it to be available in your client side, so in your Vue code. So as we are using it here in the home.vue, by accessing process env and then the name, this only works because it starts with Vue app. If I had named it just my cool name, then it would not be available there. So for your environment variables to be available in your Vue code, they need to start with Vue underscore app underscore and then your name. This is really important. Otherwise, well, you can try it, but otherwise it just won't work. So we covered a lot of ground already. We learned a lot about environment variables, the plugins, and so on. Now, I was talking about building the app before and about these different modes. Building simply means that we compile our code to a bundle. And the serve command here does this automatically. It does that in memory and spins up that development server, which then serves that development bundle with debugging tools enabled and all of that. The build command does that for a production-ready bundle. And as you can see, we got some commands set up in the package.json file, and they all use Vue CLI service. Now that's a package we didn't install. It's a package which was installed automatically, here it is, which was installed automatically when we created this project. It only exists in this project. It's not installed globally. So if you would run Vue build here, this would fail, because the Vue CLI service which is doing this only exists locally and not globally on your machine, and the Vue CLI itself does not have that functionality added to it because of that plugin-driven architecture. The build commands itself are part of a plugin too, of that CLI service plugin here basically. So you can of course add your own scripts though, like build development, and then you could define that there you want to use that local Vue CLI service. And now the interesting thing is, I can run build there, and by default this would build it for production. Now I can set my mode here, and remember I talked about mode when I talked about the environment variables. With -- mode, I can set my mode here to development. This is one of the free built-in modes. If I now save this and I run npm run build development. So I'm using that script I just created. It will use that local CLI service to create that build, and it will now not just build it for memory as it does with serve, but it will give me a build folder, that dist folder, which contains my build application, but, and that's important, in development mode, which is why it's not minified and anything like that. And it is in development mode because I set this mode to development. So this is how you can build it and how you can work with modes. And one additional note, you can also create your own modes. I can build for staging, for example. It's not one of the free built-in modes. And then I could use a .env.staging file here to set variables for my custom mode here. And with that, if I now run this again, it will still work because it accepts this custom mode too. It will then not, of course, use some of the optimizations it sets on its own for production, for example, because it is in production mode. But if you tweak the Webpack config and set your own custom variables here, you can run your custom mode. You just have to do more work then. Because, as I just explained, the build, for example, will not be optimized because it's not building for production. So it doesn't detect that this should be comparable to production, for example. But if you need all that fine tuning, you can dig into the official Webpack configuration and you can set your own mode. And that is really the cool thing. A lot of it works out of the box. Then you can add plugins. And if you need full control, you can have that too. You can customize everything essentially. Now let me come back to these builds and what we got there. The Vue CLI has another cool feature which is named instant prototyping. I mentioned that these commands here, which you execute in a package.json file with these scripts, that these commands aren't available globally because the Vue CLI service is a local package installed into that project. Well, you can install a global Vue CLI service. You install it with npm install -g to install it globally. And then it's @vue/cli-service-global. And on Mac and Linux, you might need to add sudo at the beginning again. This will now install that. It will install that CLI service, which you also used locally in the project here, globally. So then you will be able to run Vue build on a global level, which is nice. But there's one feature which is a lot nicer actually, which I want to show you. So let's wait for this to finish. So for me, it did finish, and now I could run Vue build here too. I would have to target a file though. I'll come back to that in a second. But another cool feature I want to show you first is called instant prototyping. Let's say you have such a project, or you have a totally empty folder with one Vue component only. hello.vue. This is now not embedded into my project. It's not even in the source folder. And in there, I'll just add my template where I add a h1 tag where I say hello. And this is a very simple Vue component. And of course, you could use a script there, add styles, things like that. If you just want to serve such a component and have a look at it, you can now run Vue serve, and for that you need that global CLI service, and then the name of the Vue component you want to serve. And this now starts a development server and loads this Vue component into it. So you can inspect a single Vue component. Of course, if that component depends on things like routing and so on, it'll get hard because that information will then probably be missing. But if you just want to look at a standalone component, now I can reload my dev server and I just see hello. And this is this one component getting loaded here. And this is pretty awesome in my opinion because this gives you a way of quickly creating new components and looking into them and working on single components if you just need that functionality, if you don't want to work on the entire app all the time. And kind of related to this is one advanced feature or one cool feature related to building, which I also want to show you. Vue serve was nice, but now let me also show you something regarding the build process. Thus far, we used the package.json file, and there I said that the build command would build it for production. And that is true. The question just is, what does it build for production? And as it turns out, we have 3 different build targets or 3 different ways of building that application. And with that, I'm not talking about the modes. Instead, when building a Vue project or when building a Vue component even, we can build it for or as a Vue app. We can also build it as a Vue library though, which we could use in other apps if we're building our own component library, for example. Or, and that's really awesome, we could build a web component. And a web component is now not a Vue app, but it's a normal web component. And in case you don't know what that is, it's like a custom HTML element, and that is just what Vue components are, right? But a custom HTML element which you can use outside of Vue applications too. And that's the awesome thing. You don't need to embed it into a root Vue instance. You can dump it into a HTML file. Then you need to add 2 JavaScript imports because it still is driven by JavaScript behind the scenes, but it's registered as a standalone element to the browser. This is an official browser API web components. So we can then build our Vue components as reusable web components, which we can use in a React project, in an Angular project, or in a vanilla JS project. Let's have a look at this step by step. The Vue app is what we built thus far. We run it with Vue build -- target app or just Vue build. It's the default. The default target is app. This gives us a normal Vue app bundle, which is optimized, minified, where code splitting is automatically used to lazy load routes where you configured them to be lazy loaded. Have a look at the routing section to learn how that worked. And it includes your code and the Vue framework because it gives you an entire bundle which runs standalone, where you don't need to add any other imports. Now for the library, you build that with Vue build target lib. What this does is it gives you a project which holds your code, and that's of course a typical use case would be a bunch of components to build a Vue component library. It does not include the Vue framework though. So if you use that library, you need to ensure that you use it in a new Vue application, which then includes your code, which then includes that library, and the Vue framework. So this is how that would work. And for the web component, we run it with Vue build -- target WC. There also is an alternative command for code split web components, which is a bit more advanced. It's basically web components which are loaded lazily. You find more details in the official docs. But the functionality is similar. And then you get a distributable web component. And this is just a file, a JavaScript file, which you dump into any project. You will still need to import Vue there, but you won't need to create a root Vue instance. You just can use your HTML tag thereafter. So this also includes just your code, not Vue, and therefore you will need to import Vue still. But don't create a full Vue project. Let me show you how that works and how we can utilize these features to build different things. So back in the project, I want to show this at the example of this hello Vue file here. Let's run Vue build and target hello.vue and then add -- target app, which is the default. If I do that, it builds for production by default, as you can see. And by the way, the more common way of using this command, of course, would be to use it on the entire project with just a build command and package.json, which takes your source folder and there the main.js file and Vuex and so on. I just want to show this command on this simple example of one file. But typically, if you build an app, you would take the whole project folder and not a single component. But now I built an app based on that hello.vue file. And in the dist folder, I therefore get my JavaScript folder, which holds all the code, which includes the Vue framework, as I said, and also my component code, which would be stored in here. And now we can serve that. And for that, we just need a HTTP server because double-clicking on the index.html file won't load due to the JavaScript features being used. You can install such a server with npm install -g to install it globally. HTTP-server, for example, that's a simple node server which allows you to statically serve your web projects. And on Mac and Linux, you need to add sudo in front of that. And with that installed, you can navigate into the dist folder with cd dist in your project folder and then run HTTP server in there. And it will automatically pick up the index.html file and start serving this on that URL. That is the URL I used before. So if I simply reload now, I see hello again, but this is now not my development mode. I did quit that server. Instead, it really is my build project. It's my built and minified project. And as you see, you can even build a simple single Vue component as a Vue app. Typically, as I said, though, you would, of course, build an entire project folder. And therefore, you would just run npm run build to use that local CLI service and that build command which automatically targets the source folder and then the main.js file there. Still nice to have. Now let's go out of the dist folder, back to the root folder, and let's try Vue build hello.vue with target set to lib. If I do that, it now builds a library which we can use in other Vue projects. So in the dist folder, we therefore simply get a bunch of outputs, which we could now distribute as an npm package. And for that, you should, of course, look how that works and how you really create a production-ready package. But in the end, this now can use your code. It pulls in the Vue framework itself here from a CDN because that is not included in the library. Why is it not included, by the way? Well, to not include it twice and therefore bloat your final app code. So here we then export Vue separately, and then here it pulls in our library code and simply uses it. So this is a nice demo. It sets up a very simple app where it basically showcases what you had there. In the end, you would have a library which you could pull into other projects, into other Vue projects, and then import from that library, well, as you configure it, basically. So as you also import from the Vuetify library and so on. So you can create libraries in an easier way with that. And now let's have a look at the last build command, Vue build hello.vue with target wc. If I hit enter here, I get an error that we also must define a name here. And that name is actually the tag which we will later be able to use. So here I will give this the --name configuration and name this my-greetings. And you should use a name which has a hyphen in there to not clash with default HTML tags. So with that, it will build that web component for production as it says. And in the dist folder, you now find these files, and you also find a demo here. And that demo is very simple. It imports Vue because you still need that dependency. And then my-greeting.js, you also have a minified version available for production or for distribution then. And my-greeting.js is really just, in the end, a normal web component which still relies on Vue a bit, but it's not a complete Vue app here. You don't create a Vue instance anywhere. You just use this in a normal HTML file as a normal HTML element. And this could be a file which also uses Angular, for example. So that's really awesome. You can now use your Vue components in any web project. Browser support is something to consider for that, and the official docs tell you more about that. But in the end, this is something which is extremely interesting already and will probably become more interesting even in the future. So with that, this was a lot about the new CLI. There's one last thing I want to cover. What if you still want to use Vue init? By default, this will not work because the new CLI replaced that Vue command, which the old CLI also used. So to make Vue init work again, you just need to install a global package. You can run that or install that on Mac and Linux with sudo npm install -g. On Windows, it's just npm install -g. And then the name of the package you need is @vue/CLI init. And this will now enable that init command again. So now you can run Vue init again in exactly the same way as we used it in this course. So Vue init, then which template you want to use, and then the name of the project. So if you prefer this approach, you can still do that. I can now still run Vue init, webpack -simple, Vue old CLI, for example. If I hit enter, it will create a new Vue project based on that old CLI. So I can answer this, and I got this project. So this is still possible with the help of this extra package. So now you really got the best of both worlds. You can stick to the old CLI if you prefer that, or use the new CLI with all the great features I showed you in this video. With all of that, we saw the core features of the new CLI, but one important and interesting feature is missing. Back in the terminal, let's run Vue UI. Because the new Vue CLI actually has a graphical user interface which you can use. This command starts it and should automatically open up a tab in the browser which hosts it. If not, you can visit this page to see it. And this is what it looks like. This is a graphical manager, and which basically gives you access to the same commands we ran from within the command line, but now with this nice interface. Here you can see existing projects you created. I have none. So this is basically Vue create. And there you got your file system where you can navigate around. So in there, you could navigate into a folder where you want to create a new project. You can also, by the way, favorite that path so that you can always quickly access that folder in the future. You can then create a new subfolder if you want, show hidden folders, and then in the end, create a new project, as you can see. You can then define a name for the folder which will be created, like Vue CLI UI. Choose the package manager you want to use for managing the dependencies in a project. If you only got npm installed, you will only use that. But if you have Yarn, you have the choice, you have the alternative there. You can choose if you want to override that folder if it already exists. And you can decide if you're using Git, if you want to initialize this already. Now with that, if we click on next, we go to the presets page. And now we can choose to take our saved preset, the default one, or use the manual approach, where we then will go to the next page, and now we can check some features. And this is exactly the same set of features we were presented in the terminal. So here I could then enable router, Vuex, and let's say CSS preprocessing. Click next again. Finally here, you can add some configuration for the presets, for the features you added, for the plugins you added. This also was something you got asked when using the terminal. Now it's in here. So here we can choose for the CSS preprocessing, which preprocessor to use, for linting, which configuration to use, and to lint on save. And then we can create the project. We can now also save this preset, just as we could in the terminal, or continue without saving. And now this will take a while, as it will create this new folder and install all the dependencies in there. It's up to you, of course, if you want to use that user interface or the terminal. I personally find the terminal to be a bit faster for me, but this, of course, is a bit easier to work with, I'd argue, and it's always nice to have a graphical user interface. Now let's wait for this to finish. And with it finished, this is now the project we're in. Now you can always go back by clicking on the home icon there. Now you should see your project there, and there you can go back into the project. And here you see the installed plugins. You can add a new plugin if you want. And there you can now also search. So for example, if I search for Vuetify here, it finds that plugin. So that's very convenient. This is a way to find all the available plugins. This is a registry where you can search plugins or simply browse them all, of course. And let's say I want to add that Vuetify plugin again, then I can simply click on it here, install that plugin, and now it will do that same thing it did in the terminal. Download it, and once it's done, it will also ask you for the configuration that plugin needs. So here it is. I can now choose if I want to use a custom theme, no, pre-made template, yes, a la carte components, Babel polyfill, finish installation. And this will then, well, execute that or install that plugin and do all these changes, apply all these changes. You can actually see the changes here before they are applied. So that's really great. You see what will change, and then you can commit this here to GitHub, or you skip to just apply them. And with that, this is now added. We can also configure some settings here on this screen. For example, the base URL. These are also things you could do from within the CLI. The official docs show you a full reference of CLI commands you can run in the terminal to configure an existing project. Here you have them all on one page, all these settings. And in that last area here, you then have these commands you can run. So you can build it, you can serve it, you can lint it. Inspect is an extra command which lets you look into the webpack config you're using in the project. Vue inspect would be the terminal command you could have also executed. And overall, I can only encourage you to play around with that and to take advantage of this graphical interface, especially for browsing available plugins. I'd argue that this is especially useful. And overall, it's a nice alternative to the terminal-driven CLI, and it's good to have this as it can really speed up your development process.